I think that perhaps we will start now. Perhaps some people will still arrive, but maybe it's best to get a start. Hello, and welcome to the 18th Annual Wolodymyr Dylynsky Memorial Lecture. This event has been organized by the Toronto office of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta, in cooperation with the Petroyatsik Program for the Study of Ukraine and the Center for European and Eurasian Studies, University of Toronto. I am Tanya Plauszczak-Stech. I am the managing editor of scholarly publications at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, or CIUS. And I have the pleasure of chairing today's event in my capacity as coordinator of the CIUS Dylynsky Lecture Series. I would first like to extend a warm welcome to Miron Dylynsky and Olena Hrabovecka-Dylynsky, the generous supporters of this lecture series. Since 2006, the Wolodymyr Dylynsky Lecture Series has featured prominent specialists in the history of 20th century Ukraine or in the affairs of independent Ukraine. This year's lecture, the 18th in the series, is dedicated to a very timely and vitally important topic relating to Russia's current war against Ukraine. And ironically, we are holding this lecture on the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, which occurred on December 5th, 1994. The title of the 2024 Wolodymyr Dylynsky Memorial Lecture is Russia's Propaganda State, Creation of the War Against Ukraine. For many people in the West, including the majority of Western scholars studying Eastern Europe, the launch of the unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation in February 2022 was a shocking and unexpected turn of events. But this Russian war of aggression against Ukraine was incepted by no means haphazardly. This war is occurring as a consequence of deliberate political choices made by Russian ruling circles over an extended period of time. The groundwork for the Kremlin's assault on Ukraine was carefully prepared through an array of large-scale operations conducted both within Russia and internationally. The aggressive imperialist policies toward Ukraine have been consistently implemented not only by the Vladimir Putin regime, but also by its predecessors. As the title of today's lecture suggests, the ruling powers of Russia have, quote-unquote, crafted this war against Ukraine. And at the heart of the political maneuvering that led to this war was and is Putin's and the Kremlin's choice to deny the right of Ukrainians to exist as a distinct and independent nation, as a nation with its own history, unique cultural heritage, and the right to decide its own future. Our distinguished speaker today is Andrew Wilson, Professor of Ukrainian Studies at University College London in Great Britain. Professor Wilson is a prominent specialist in the modern history of Ukraine and Eastern Europe. He is the author of several monographs and numerous scholarly articles. His most recent book publications include Political Technology, the Globalization of Political Manipulation, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. Professor Wilson, that's the book you have with you, correct? Good, it's outside. And The Ukrainians, the Story of How a People Became a Nation, new edition, published by Yale University Press in 2022. You may also find Professor Wilson's brief, informative videos on YouTube under the handle UCL, Ukrainian Society. And tonight's lecture will also be subsequently published on YouTube under the handles CEES at Monk and Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. A keen and insightful analyst of contemporary Russo-Ukrainian relations, Professor Wilson is currently completing his newest book, titled How Russia Created the Propaganda that Helped Create the War Against Ukraine. And this evening, he will address some of the fundamental issues pertinent to this book's subject matter. For example, questions of how the Putin regime mastered the methods of quote-unquote political technology in order to gain control of Russia's domestic politics, later expanding into the spheres of history, international relations, and even church matters. Also, the issues of how Russia has used political technology in its attempts to justify its full-scale war against Ukraine to international onlookers, and how this war has increasingly been framed by Russian political technology as an existential contest between Russia and the West as a whole. Some of these issues were also discussed by Professor Wilson in his excellent essay titled "The Political Technology Takeover of Russian History." This essay was just published in the newest book from CAUS Press called "The Unpredictable Past: Reshaping Russian, Ukrainian, and East European Studies," and edited by Wolodymyr Kravchenko and Marko Robert-Stech. Professor Wilson was one of 30 prominent international scholars especially invited to contribute to this book in order to participate in a discussion of feasible ways for fundamentally rethinking and, so to speak, decolonizing the international studies of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe in the wake of Russia's full-scale war on Ukraine and its aftermath. We are introducing this book to the Toronto public at this event. So thank you very much for your attention, and I invite Professor Wilson to the podium.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming on a cold evening. I'll start with a triple apology. First, I have an infected ear, so can't really hear what I'm saying, but hopefully you can. Secondly, a terrible English accent. Hopefully that isn't a problem. Thirdly, this will be a bit dry. My mission tonight is to explain what political technology is, maybe an unfamiliar term to most of you, why it works, and the fact that because it's the operating code of the Russian political system, it is the key to, well, one of the many keys to long-term peace, which requires much more than military victory for Ukraine. It requires the dismantling of Russia's propaganda state. So I'd like to start by quoting somebody else's work, very good work. Young British academic called Jade McGlynn wrote this excellent book called Russia's War, which has two meanings. Firstly, in terms of decision-making and moral accountability, this is Putin's war. He started it. 3 or 4 other people only were involved in making the decision. But McGlynn uses the term Russia's war in 2 senses. One, ordinary Russians support it, and they support it because of the second sense, that the war they support, the war they're seeing on their TV and hearing about online, is very different to the real war. It's an alternative reality. So we've seen opinion polls. Here, the red line, or rather 2 red lines at the top, show Russian support for the special military operation in Ukraine, so-called. Going up and down a little, but basically majoritarian and not changing much. This is unfortunately in Russian, but support for the war is either in dark blue or light blue. And this data series is much more up to date as far as October 2024. You can see at the bottom there. And what you can see is no change. Right? So despite the many years of the war, majoritarian support is still high. So in McGlynn's sense, this is Russia's war. So how do we explain this support? Well, I was asking our hosts here if wrestling was a popular sport in North America. Probably more popular in America than Canada, I guess. Kayfabe is the art of presenting a carefully staged drama as something real, which is therefore emotionally engaging. Right? So the audience at wrestling knows that what they're seeing is partly scripted, partly real, but they enjoy watching it. That's one possible explanation, but I'm afraid is not sufficient. Later on, I'll be talking about what Russians call humanitarian technology, brainwashing, which is a sub-branch of political technology about how to permanently change people's opinions. And one of the biggest changes, which I'll be talking about, is how, first of all, history was politicized, and then that politicized history was moved into the education system, particularly from 2022 onwards, the start of the full-scale invasion. So Russia, or the Kremlin, is planning to make this propagandized narrative that captures Russians' hearts and minds at the moment permanent. Now, there are many problems with opinion polling during times of war, but the Russian polls are fairly clear. Here's a more reliable Ukrainian one. In March, Ukrainians were asked, what is the probability of Russia attacking Ukraine again if there is a signed peace treaty? As you can see, 68 plus 18 say a high or a medium chance. And notice that there's no adjective attached to peace treaty. It doesn't say bad peace treaty, doesn't say Trump imposed peace treaty, it says any peace treaty. So this is the mirror image, that Ukrainians think that Russia's war is now a permanent, or the psychological aspects of Russian war, the attitudinal aspects are deep-rooted, and that both the leadership and Russian people would support renewed war. Because, my explanation, Russians are currently trapped in this alternative reality, which has been carefully constructed so that collectively it makes sense if you're trapped in that narrative. Which is why we as outsiders can't understand it, because most of the individual points don't make sense. Right? The idea that Ukrainians are Nazis is, of course, absurd, but it doesn't mean that. It means they are anti-Russian, or another Russian phrase, they are seeking to replace, stand instead of historical Russia. But the first thing I've got to do, or the second thing I've got to do, is explain what political technology is. So this is the book. I'm very pleased with the cover, which is by Ukrainian cartoonist Oleg Smal from the deoccupied city of Kherson, which is appropriate in itself. But it shows you both the big lie machine, the Pinocchio, and the importance of the people who build it. And you can either buy the book, or if you're interested, there are some open access free materials online at politicaltechnology.blog. If you're Russian, I wouldn't need to define the term for you. Everybody knows what it means. Or do they? If you ask Russians to define this ubiquitous term, they give you cynical answers to the effect that politics has always been about manipulation. Politics has always been about this type of manipulation. This is a Russian cartoon translated. A formidable array of instruments for engineering the political system. But it's not true that all politics is manipulation, although there have been some types of manipulation ever present in history. So my definition is imposed. Political technology is the supply-side engineering of the political system for partisan advantage. It's something that elites do, supply side. It's not something that people vote for or are even aware of. It's engineering the political system with these formidable instruments, and it's a bad thing. It's done for elites, for their own advantage or their own ideological purpose, or to disguise their own shortcomings. So political technologists are elites, real people. Here's four, plus Putin. The political technologist is a guy to his left. First and most famous in the 90s and the noughties was Gleb Pavlovsky. Symbolically, he was one of 3 people who died within a year of the full-scale invasion starting, rather completing a circle. One of the others is Mikhail Gorbachev. The other was Zhirinovsky, one of the key actors in this system. Then going clockwise, you have Vladislav Surkov. Wolodymyr Dylynsky, you will say, he's a historian. No, he's not. He's a political technologist, as I'll explain in a minute, who happens to be in charge of Russian history. And a really interesting figure, Sergei Kirienko, who is deputy head of the presidential administration in charge of politics. Right? The fact that that job exists tells you a lot. He's the chief political curator. Not my words, but the words of the Department of Justice of the United States of America in a recent indictment of some of his employees. He's the chief political curator of Russian politics. So you have these people, and you have firms. Back in the 90s, and in Russian, top left, if any of you can read Russian, the first Russian PR company, proudly called Nikola M, with its logo, its website, its business cards, featuring this picture of Machiavelli. That's what they're selling. The biggest and most important, basically this whole building on the river Moskva, was called FEP, the Foundation for Effective Politics. Politics has to be effective. It's all about winning elections and staying in power. There's actually a plaque on the corner of the building which basically says, we saved Russia by, in this building, the saving of Russia was achieved via the election of Vladimir Putin in 1999-2000. If you're really interested, the word foundation comes from Isaac Asimov. In the novels, the empire is in decline. This is science fiction novels. The empire is in decline, so a group of intellectuals armed with the scientific knowledge of what's it called, psychohistory, travel to a far corner of the empire to use their knowledge in manipulating society, predicting its future, to arrange the restoration of the empire. Right? So this is these guys' self-image. Right? Intellectuals manipulating ordinary people to restore the empire. Nowadays it's also think tanks. Both are, in Russian terms, and these are 2 Russian cartoons, fabriki mysli, factories of thought, resources of influence, that says in Russian. So we think of think tanks as boring things. They think, they come up with policy proposals, they try and persuade governments, policymakers to follow those proposals. Fabriki mysli are factories of people's thought. Right? They create systems of thought to manipulate human behavior. Or they are think tanks that are actually tanks, as you see on the right. So, what did political technology do? Well, it creates, first of all, political subjects. Starting off in the 90s, everything was called a project in Russia. It was artificial. A new party, a political candidate like Wolodymyr Zhirinovsky, who now exists, by the way, in virtual form, which is pretty scary, the AI Zhirinovsky. You start off with individual elements, which, if they become more important, are what Russians call levers. This was a reference to crucial 1996 election when Boris Yeltsin was unpopular. So the political technologists created a covert third candidate to run in covert support. So this levered the result. It was also called a relay race. He was supposed to hand over his popularity to Yeltsin in the second round. So in that election, most of the politicians were real, but you now have a political technology creation who decides the result. The next phase I called virtual political geometry. You start to control all the elements in the political system and how they interact in various transitional ways. Before about 2003, 2004, by which time everything in Russian politics is scripted. Right? All politicians are basically actors. Right? They've all been captured by this system. Allied to your control of political subjects, you control what they say. So political technology takes over political narrative in the same way. Starting off with small elements. A vbros is a toss-in, a particular story or scandal, and progressing to what Russians call dramaturgia, meaning a dramaturg is a playwright, but it means much more than a play. It means a hegemonic narrative on which everybody is focused. You exclude all other points of view because you have the power to sell that in the media. So all political actors are created by political technology and scripted by political technology, regardless of who they are. Right? The Kremlin scripts its own supporters also, because it distrusts any type of political agency. So this is highly mediatized. In those days, back in the 90s and noughties, politics was TV. So you had a whole cast of characters and narrative deliverers with words like telekiller or toilet pipe. That's this lady's nickname, toilet pipe, spewing out disinformation. And they worked with fake ordinary people, fake vox populi, fake experts, fake events in Ukraine, fake Ukrainians on Russian TV. Ukrainians are all over Russian TV. Good Ukrainians, bad Ukrainians, Nazi Ukrainians, pro-Russian Ukrainians, fighting Ukrainians, really popular, causing fights with ordinary Russians. All in highly scripted performance. There are all sorts of Russian terms for many types of mediatized spectacle. Putingi are, well, Putin is Putin, meeting is meeting, plural meetingi. So Putingi are pro-Putin meetings, carefully staged. Though again, there are plenty of people who do like Putin. You could stage a rally of genuine supporters, but Russian political technologists prefer to script them. If you look at the word masovka, you get either of two things in Russian: either extras on a film set, or people paid to attend or organised to attend a political rally. Seen as the same thing. Claqué. Great word. It's from French opera. Claqueurs in the 19th century were gangs who would either boo people they didn't like unless you paid them not to, or who were in carefully scripted roles. Young women crying at the emotional bits in opera or whatever. You know, there were companies in Paris and Milan who would sell you claqueurs, artificial applause or criticism. So the same word in Russian. And same techniques deployed abroad. When Russia organised pro-Russian crowds in East Ukraine in 2014, they were called specturisti, special tourists. So you have both political technologists and scenaristi, scene writers who script a lot of this. And you have the firms, the think tanks, the fabriki mysli, who steer all this in what is now a very mature system of writing and scripting politics. It includes NGOs. Some of you may be familiar with the alternative term to NGO, GONGO. Instead of non-government organisation, government-organised non-government organisation. Right? But really these are prongos. I've just made up. Or really it should be PTONGO. Political technology or PR NGOs that exist solely to sell a narrative. And we'll see lots of these in history, but they exist in the sphere of religion, in international relations, and all sorts of other areas. So what you get is a virtual chorus. You have the politicians working for the political technologists, supported by media, supported by flanking think tanks or foundations or fake experts or surrogate actors. So within this pyramid, a kind of horizontal chorus where everybody is saying the same thing or different versions of the same thing that all chime together. And that works, of course, in media. Many parts of Russian media exist to be quoted by the other parts. Right? Quotability is a key technique in political technology, that you exist in order to be quoted. At home and abroad, where you have all sorts of hybrid organizations which echo and promote Russian media messages. This is also, as well as being mediatized, it's multimedia. TV was the original medium, but internet and social media turned out to be a perfect tool as well. Publishing, but with a strong preference for storytelling and the emotional. TV, film, YouTube in particular. This is a Department of Justice indictment that was made this year for about half a dozen of these guys for their propaganda activities in the US during the recent election. I'd recommend everybody to read it because there's a fascinating annex, which is basically Kremlin minutes of the meetings between Kirienko and his political technologists, in which there's all sorts of crazy stuff that they say. They mix the language of real and fake. We need real facts to complement fake facts, they say. Sometimes they put fact before real, sometimes real before fact. They talk about us and them. Our fakes are better than their fakes. Gambashidze himself is very young, and he's actually in a jacket saying #1 Russian PR. You can't quite see it there. But the two terms that are used are doprealnost, pre-reality, and doполнение realnost, augmented reality. Right? So these guys don't believe in a horizontal distinction between fact and fiction. They believe that they're kind of, in the 1960s sense, situationists. That the expression of and mediation of social relations through image and meme creates reality. What they are doing themselves is creating reality. And I like this phrase from an Atlantic Council report. By employing information warfare, the Kremlin seeded false and misleading narratives to justify military action against Ukraine, mask its operational planning, and deny any responsibility for the coming war, a war that was ultimately one of Putin's own choosing. But the key phrase that I added the emphasis to, these lies, deceptions, and exaggerations were not in support of the Kremlin's casus belli. They were the Kremlin's casus belli. Right? The entire narrative was created for said political purpose. And one other quote, just to finish this section. This is Margarita Simonian, who is head of RT, which used to be called Russia Today, speaking last year. The war needs to run its course, and then the work begins cleaning slag-ridden brains from these slags, meaning Ukrainians. The majority of people change their opinions under the influence of information. So we can stop hating Ukrainians when the war ends, when it ends with our victory, with God's help, when they get an opportunity to get other sources of information they don't have now, when they will be getting this information from books and textbooks, from TV programs and normal media. They will digest it and gradually become normal people. And all this will pass between us. Right? So just as we have propagandized Russians at home, we will do the same with Ukrainians, and they will end up thinking like us as well. Okay, that's the opening story about political technology. There's also a political story. That there is a sense and James Scher and others have written about this, in which Russia has been prepared to accept nominal Ukrainian independence since 1991, but самостоятельной Украины никогда не будет. A Ukraine capable of standing on its own 2 feet will never be. And often in Russian propaganda, you can see this mocked as Samostina Ukraina. You get the Ukrainian word written in little letters before the Russian word. Yes, but there has been different phases in Russian policy. Most important which, soon after Putin coming to power, was how Russia reacted to the Orange Revolution in 2004. Russia intervened very heavily with its political technologies, on the side of their candidate as they saw it, Viktor Yanukovych, and lost. So the same people invented a story to excuse their failure, which was the myth of coloured revolution, which in their terms meant a political technology operation conducted by foreign powers through proxy organisations, through media organisations, to create a fictional narrative and justify a unconstitutional seizure of power. Which is nonsense. That's not what happened. But Russia started living in this big lie alternative reality already after 2004. Right? Otherwise, some things like Putin's Munich speech don't make sense, which is in 2007. It looks out of sync with other things, like the war in Georgia, which came in 2008. Already, after 2004, Russia had created the first part of this alternative reality universe about the hostile West fomenting special operations closer and closer to Russian borders. Then there is a story, very well told in Maria Popova and Oksana Chevel's recent book, about political divergence between Russia and Ukraine. Entangled histories, diverging states. In the two crucial years between 2012 and 2014. Failed popular protest in Russia in 2012, the return of Putin with a different political project, and of course the revolution of dignity in Ukraine, 2013 to 14. So two countries moving in very different opposite directions. I would argue that 2019 is also important in that Russia chose to decide that the election of Dylynsky made no difference, right? Because he also was part of the Maidan regime, and another invented concept. And in political technology terms, you see a shift from what were often disposable, one-off kind of narratives. 1996, it was Yeltsin versus the communists. 1999, 2000, it was Putin versus the Chechens. 2003, it was Putin versus the oligarchs. Who remembers any of that? Because none of it had lasting impact. From 2012 onwards, 2014 onwards, political technology becomes fixated on a single narrative. The threat from the West through Russia, the existential threat from the West through Ukraine to Russia. And at the same time, political technology moves into many other areas to metastasize this narrative of threat, including history in particular. So before we get to history, political technology moves into all of these areas at the same time. Russians openly talk about something called counter-revolutionary technology. So how you stop coloured revolutions that happened abroad, happening in Russia too. The idea of Russian world is created by political technologists. More about them in a minute. History, church affairs, everything is propaganda. I love this slogan from the 2007 elections. Could be any election really in Russia. Plan Putina. Just says Putin's plan. ... No literal dots, but whatever Putin's plan is, you should support. And Putin's plan is now increasingly fixed and metastasized. So it starts knitting together a lot of parallel monotheisms. Right? Russia has often been fond of messianic thinking in geopolitics, in theology, but it starts to knit everything together with the same kind of political technology methods. So instead of one pyramid, you had all of these pyramids together, and you have political technologists everywhere. There's a good study by the University of Bath that came out this year, which looks at how many courses there are in political technology, political communications, PR at Russian university, and exactly what happens to the kind of hundreds of people who end up with a degree in these subjects. But they're now in all sorts of areas. In education, guy on the top right, guy on the top left work for the Russian Orthodox Church. But Shchipkov, this guy here, is he interested in God? No, well, sometimes. But he wrote this book called Unfinished Nazism. Right? And if your eyesight is good, you can see that the most Nazi regime on the planet is mine, because that's Houses of Parliament. Right? It's a pretty absurd book. So you now have the virtual chorus knitting together all these genres. So round this table, this is a meeting called The Ideology of Ukrainism as the Foundation for the Anti-Russia Project, February 2024. So without going through all the details, you have all of these people from these political technology NGOs, pseudo-experts, people nominally working for the church, and all other front organizations. So history, finally. History is the one area which benefits most in institutional and financial terms from this metastar-sized narrative after 2012, 2014. Gets much more money. It gets its job is Historia Bestia, which means history frenzy. Right? To create through history a friend-enemy distinction, in the words of philosopher Carl Schmitt. A much clearer us and them to knit people together and cement their support for Putin. And in this history virtual chorus again, more about that in a minute, there is some of what academics call participatory propaganda. Right? You outsource a lot of your propaganda writing to entrepreneurs online, and there's plenty of money if your product gets taken up. And that's one thing that helps people stick to the script once that script is created. So you see in history the same structures and the same methods, NGOs, multimedia product, online, publishing, oligarch funding, think tanks, all working together via the steerage of political technologists in the history world. The most important of which is at the bottom. Wolodymyr Dylynsky. This guy here. More about that picture in a minute. But there are many others. History entrepreneurs, right? Might look like crazy guys putting out low-quality literature. But there's an awful lot of this Putin, for example, is a big fan of Mikhail Yuriev and his kind of fantasy book about the Third Empire, when hopefully you can see the Russian Empire restores itself and is victorious, conquers Europe, Britain, Greenland, and divides up the world with these other big empires. There is a genre of Ukrainophobic trash literature, right? With names like Ukrainian Catastrophe, The End of Project Ukraine, or the one on the bottom left, which is actually a pun on a book by Leonid Kushma, Ukraine is Not Russia. So this one is just called Ukraine is Russia. A lot of which works through popular culture memes. Three of these come from a movie called Brat, and its successor, Brat 2, or Brat 2. Strength in Truth, which is extremely ironic because there's no truth here. We don't leave ours behind. We look after our own. And those of you who know Możemy powtórzyć, you'll know that on the top right, I had a long time finding a photograph that was showable, right? For reasons of good taste, because normally this meme is not showable in a public space. At the centre of all this, Dylynsky. You could joke that he's a typical Russian historian. Both of his PhDs were plagiarized, right? Which is very Russian. But he's more than a bad historian. He is a political technologist who, in the 90s, worked for one of the most famous PR companies, or political technology companies, called Yeah, for banks, cigarette companies, notorious pyramid scheme MMM. Then he was a politician. The books that he's wrote are all very strange books about history. They're about PR in Russian history. Myths about Russia. Scoundrels and Geniuses. PR from Rurik to Ivan the Terrible in Russia. And as part of this huge institutional expansion, Putin made him culture minister for 10 years, from 2012, 8 years, beg your pardon. He's slightly shunted aside. He's now head of one of these big NGOs. And yes, he was in charge of negotiations, brief negotiations that didn't go anywhere with the Ukrainian side in the spring of 2022. They didn't go anywhere because why would the Ukrainians talk to someone who says Ukraine doesn't exist? But that was part of the reason why he was there for the Russians. The Dylynsky method can be seen in one of his favourite projects, which has nothing to do with Ukraine, but is emblematic and multimedia. It's a film, it's a monument about the so-called Panfilov 28. In winter of 1941, as the Germans marched on Moscow, supposedly these guys stopped a key Russian attack and paid for that with their lives. Even the USSR knew this was a fabrication, right? So they didn't really go anywhere near it. But according to Dylynsky, my fundamental conviction is that even if this story is completely made up from beginning to end, even if there was no Panfilov, even if there was nothing, this is a sacred legend that you just can't touch. If you like your motherland, your people, your history, what you'll be writing will always be positive. The facts themselves don't mean much in historical mythology, they do not mean anything. Everything begins not with facts, but with interpretations. All states must systematically influence public consciousness or lose sovereignty to other powers who will. Dylynsky has this phrase in Russian, pravdivaya historia. So the PR in truth, the PR in historical truth is what matters. Because your rivals always have PR against you. He talks about Orsha propaganda. This is a battle of the Polish-Lithuanian Rzeczpospolita against Polish-Lithuanian Ruthenian Rzeczpospolita against Moscow. Moscow lost. But Orsha propaganda is supposedly the exaggeration of victory against Moscow, according to Dylynsky. But this was a big event. This is Putin and Nazarbayev watching the film, not paying much attention. Putin himself is an element in all of this, and more about his history writing in a minute. And it uses characteristically postmodern political technology methods. Montage and papadnichestvo, which means time travel, using the Second World War in today's reports about the war against Ukraine. Not just making an analogy, but literally having footage of the Second World War in what's supposed to be a news report about current events. Inverting, as you'll already have seen in several examples, claiming that the West is doing this against Russia, and therefore Russia has to defensively do it against the West. Mixing up, and this is where current Russian propaganda is very different to Soviet propaganda, which was dull and normally unsuccessful. Agitainment, right? Making sure your agitprop is emotive and engaging and has a popular audience. Dylynsky is all over YouTube, social media, where you can find all these other political technology projects to sell a particular line. This one in particular, hugely popular, Empire in Reverse, Imperia Naoborot, that Russia wasn't a classic empire because it developed its colonies rather than exploiting them, supposedly. And some other adjunct methods. Exhibitions. Again, this preference for the visual and the engaging. A lot of these are set up by political technology priest, Tikhon. There's a huge number of these now, almost 30. There's a lot of buttons to press, they're very interactive, but they are exhibitions without exhibits. Right? They're just propaganda. So here on the bottom one you have Alexander Nevsky. '13th century prince saying, strengthen your defense in the West and look for friends in the East. Obviously that's supposed to be an analogy with Russia's role in the present day, distrust the West, ally with China, North Korea or whatever. I mean, this isn't in inverted commas, but it's clearly presented as a quote, right? Something that Nevsky said, which obviously he never did. And this is the latest iteration that Russia is building in Crimea, at the ancient Byzantine city of Chersonesus. Unfinished as yet, but huge, as you can see. Has an amphitheatre. Why? I don't know. But everything, well, the way that this particular version of the exhibition's work is you ignore Crimean Tatar history, it's diminished basically to zero, and you emphasize the imperial history that came after it. And there is a general history of early Christianity as well, which is annexed as basically Russian. Right? So instead of an incredibly short settler colonial period, either from 1783 or from the Crimean War till, say, 1917, when Crimea was first Russian, you have this 2,000-year narrative created instead, with Crimean Tatar period in the middle, almost missing. So here again we have Putin as a key history entrepreneur in this system. On the left, his famous article in 2021 on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which is not a one-off. It's now this huge source book of documents. And it feeds into various new histories of Ukraine via this process. Here's Putin meeting with Dylynsky. New York Times article describes it very well. In general, the process looks like this. The president dictates his theses to Mr. Dylynsky, who develops them and dictates them in turn to his assistants. They write the essays, and then the texts go in the opposite direction to Mr. Dylynsky, and finally to Mr. Putin to be edited, which produces a lot of bad history. A lot of you may be familiar with this scene, where Putin is proudly showing that the word Ukraine doesn't exist on this medieval map, which of course it does. In fact, if you blow up the big map and look at the top, the word Russia doesn't appear. It's called Moscovy. It also results in very ahistorical history. In Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson, famously he begins with Russian history begins in 862 AD, and then talks for 40 minutes without any humans, without any subjectivity, without any events. Interesting phrase in his history essay. Putin says, of course, some parts of a people in the process of its development, influenced by a number of reasons and historical circumstances, can become aware of itself as a separate nation at a certain moment. How should we treat that? There is only one answer: with respect. All right. Well, yes. And there's more to it than that, but if Ukrainians say they are a nation, then they are a nation. So this virtual chorus structure exists within history. You have very powerful NGOs and a division of labour between them, which is summarised by one source as one part writes historical myths, the other is responsible for propelling them out, propagandising them in all directions. You have historical NGOs for foreign consumption, a kind of complex networks. This one is in the Baltic states and in Belarus, selling Russian versions of history. You have a huge number of so-called Spetsfondi, special funds, seeding, funding this system, pouring money into it. So the more entrepreneurial actors can earn considerable amounts of money by delivering the kind of history product that the Kremlin wants. Since 2022, this kind of history narrative and the structures that support it has moved en masse into education. You have this very strange elements of a state ideology called pentabasis. But more importantly, principles of Russian statehood. This is now, if you like, the closest thing that Russia has to an ideology to teach students. And conversations about important things for younger students. All supported by, remember the interlocking pyramids? The same structures in different areas sending out the same kind of messages. So in international relations, you have propaganda think tanks, but really fabrici mysli. You have a very dense network of artificial NGOs to sell these messages to foreign audiences. You have a similar structure in religion. Vanguardist organizations to script the church. A huge media empire, particularly online, beg your pardon. And these factories of thought, which in this case are mainly funded by oligarchs. Last section, specifically, what are the narratives about Ukraine? Well, they're very eclectic. This recent book by Eugene Finkel is called Intent to Destroy, Russia's 200-Year Quest to Dominate Ukraine. So his argument is focused on destruction. That at the end of the First World War, in the 30s, in West Ukraine in 1940s, during the war today, you can see very similar tactics of forcible depopulation, cultural deconstruction, renaming of places and monuments. So, although Russian political technology history is eclectic, it concentrates on those periods when Russia was doing the same thing in that 200-year period, and repeats the kind of radical anti-Ukrainian arguments that you had in those periods. So, Catherine the Great destroyed 3 states: Rzeczpospolita, the Hetmanate, and the Crimean Tatar Khanate. But you see Putin recycling a lot of arguments from this period which deny that these organizations were ever states. So when Putin says there was never a Ukrainian state, he is recycling the arguments from people like Dylynsky. The so-called Hetmanate and Zaporizhia were never a republic nor a state at all, but were some strange commune in the Asian manner. The same thing often said about Crimean Tatars. From the late imperial period, about which Faith Hillis wrote a lot, this idea of Kiev as the mother of Russian cities, but the most Russian part of Russian history. From the whites, the idea of one and indivisible Russia, and a long line of conspiracy theory about how successive versions of the West, or the Zapad in Russian, created artificial Ukraine. And although Putin is very negative about the Soviet period, there is a lot of Soviet propaganda which is also useful about Soviet great power and what Ukrainians call Russism, the quasi-ideology of post-Soviet imperial revanche. So a lot of this bad history then is kind of pastiche. It's collected from all these sources. Putin calls himself a history entrepreneur, or even just a historian. But all of that he's doing is really collecting the kind of opinions of his predecessors, politicians or publicists, without documentation or evidence. How am I doing for time? That's all right, okay. I will zoom forward a bit. Oh no, I'll have to do what I'm doing. Oops. So you have these strange exhibitions devoted to Ukrainian or anti-Ukrainian narratives. This one about Ukrainian Nazism opened in 2022 in Moscow. But compared to the Soviet period, when it was possible to have a narrative of Ukrainians as younger brothers, because the point was to assimilate them to Soviet period, now you have a much more radical narrative if the task defined by Putin is to destroy the project of the Ukrainian state. You also have the addition of political narratives, or more recent history narratives. Since 2004, you have the kind of idea that coloured revolution is an artificial Western-sponsored political project, which deconstructs the very idea of revolution, crowd narrative, collective action. Putin has this phrase, mitingovaya demokratia, meaning people meeting in a public space is not real democracy. It's just people shouting and engaging in public dispute, whereas in fact that's the original meaning of democracy. And revolution is redefined as a Western special project. So modern Ukraine was created by this special project, and therefore coup or self-reinvention displaced one type of Ukrainians, pro-Russian Ukrainians, with another. So there's this very strange idea of what's called political Ukrainianism. And this is an attack on no less than Leonid Kuchma, Ukrainian president, who, I'll summarize, at one stage realized that he was Ukrainian and changed the stress on his name. The first transnational, by analogy with a transsexual, was Leonid Danilovich Kuchma, who publicly renounced his own roots and already at the ripe old age of 63. This is political Ukrainianism, which should be defined in the criminal legislation of the Russian Federation and recognized as an extremist. So being Ukrainian is an artificial political choice and should be condemned. Even worse example by another one of these political technology historians. Ukrainian Nazism is all about the Vyshyvanka,
the Ukrainian language and hatred of Russians. The Germans were lucky their Nazism was more intellectual and created a racial theory with craniometers to justify hatred of Jews and Russians. For denazification, it was enough to get rid of that racial theory and those craniometers without touching the German language and Lederhosen. Ukrainianism is not about racism and craniometers, it's about language and vyshyvankas. Through them comes the justification of hatred, and their fate is the same as that of the swastika, once a harmless solar system and now a symbol of hateful inferno. So, Ukrainianism comes from political choice, not from history. So it's something that cannot be got rid of, other than forcibly. And here's a good example. Putin to Macron, 20th of February 2022, only a few days before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is saying, in response to Macron, who wants him to negotiate with Dylynsky, that there's no point in negotiating with Dylynsky. He's not a democratically elected government. They came to power as the result of a coup, people who were burned alive. It was a bloodbath, and Dylynsky was one of those responsible. The punchline here being that Dylynsky, at least in January 2014, was on a Russian TV, all right, doing the New Year's show. He was a long way from the Maidan events. So I'll finish where I started in the book I'm going to leave some things out. Can't get the thing back. I'll summarize it. Which is that I quoted a novel by Umberto Eco called Foucault's Pendulum, which is about a bunch of Italian publishers. Last one. A bunch of Italian publishers who use a computer program, which is named after a kind of medieval fabulist, to collect all the propaganda in history into one space. They call it the plan, but in the novel it turns out that many of the kind of conspiracies they write about are real, and they start complaining about being written about, and the fabulation takes over reality. The plan to create the biggest conspiracy theory in history becomes something that the protagonists believe in, and it ends up destroying them. So the analogy here is that the Russians believe the propaganda that they've created, but it is a political construction of choice. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Professor Wilson. I will open the floor now to questions from the audience. Do we have one? And if you could identify yourself before you ask your question, please.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Mariam. I'm a PhD student at UFT in Russian history. So my question is about the Russian diaspora and how it largely fits into this project of jingoistic nationalist propaganda. Because for a while now, there is a concerted effort in Russia from both state and academic circles to sort of bring in the Russians abroad into a wider cosmopolitan identity. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the purpose of it and how does it fit into the propaganda state?
Do you want me to do them one by one? Or?
you could sit at the table.
To answer questions.
Yes.
Answer one by one.
Sure, yes, please.
Thanks, great question. The people who came up with the idea of Wolodymyr, or Russian world, were themselves political technologists. They belong to a specific type called methodologists. The key figures in which are Georgy Shchedrovitsky and his son Pyotr Shchedrovitsky. And Georgy started pushing his ideas back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, a long time ago. They believe in what is called humanitarian technology, that you can program people, that human societies are how would you translate in Russian? Superstructures, right, in which you use semiotic and communication methods. Sounds quite complicated, but basically, you, the intelligent people, can brainwash the kind of popular hordes whom Shchedrovitsky called chelovainiki, right, human hills, right, anthills. And this is the Russians abroad. It's nothing to do with them or what they want. So you use political technology to create Russians. Right? The Russian World Project was about taking these structures, NGOs, media, and teaching people to be Russian. If they were partly Russian, you would make them more Russian. And you would make them pro-Russian or pro-Putin Russians. With the horrible truth that that is now forcibly what Russia is doing in the temporarily occupied territories. Right? That it and you saw Simonyan's quote about how easy this would be once you impose the right media and the right structures on these people, you teach them to be Russians. So a lot of people assume that this was, because Putin always quotes numbers. There are X million Russians there and there are X million Russians there. But really this was always a political technology project about teaching people to be Russian in the former Soviet Union.
We had a question here, yes, in the second row. Your hand was up.
Thank you for your presentation. In light of the extensive propaganda machine that you've outlined, do you have an estimate as to how many few hundred or even a few thousand people left in Russia would actually know the truth? Or has it been like 95, 98% of the population is now completely brainwashed by all of this? And like the people who are leading this propaganda, do they themselves, I think you implied that they themselves are now starting to believe all this, right? Because they've been exposed to this so long that, you know, people like Putin and his circle actually believe what they've been creating.
Well, the first bit of your question was about who left and who stayed. Obviously, there's been a lot of out-migration out of Russia. A lot of it was fear of the draft. In 2022, some of it's been economic. But obviously also a lot of it has been disproportionately Russians who are opposed to Putinism as a project, or to the current war, or to some aspects of this. But then there's the question of what media they consume when they're abroad. And there are some parts of the diaspora media, which support some of these narratives, and some of which support some aspects of the war. So it's not as clean as if you're abroad, you're in a completely different media environment. Slightly overlaps. Slightly. Because at home, there is this much tighter network in which most people are captive. Does Putin believe it? I think that's the wrong question. It's more the kind of way the regime talks to itself. It's a loyalty test. Everybody speaks the same way. Because that's... and you use that as a kind of... to cement loyalty. And there is a progression. Well, once you've bought the bigger lies, then you'll buy everything else that comes after it. But the system spits out people who don't repeat the narrative, don't remain in this kind of virtual chorus, because that's how it works. Plus, there are awards in being loyal to that chorus, and there are competition effects, right? To come up with more extreme versions of the narrative. And there is this kind of postmodern cynicism about pre-reality and augmented reality. That a lot of these Russians justify things to themselves by a very, quoting our own sort of postmodern philosophy about there being no universal truth, only a war of narratives. A lot of Russians will quote back Derrida or other philosophers in justification of that. Because if you are, plus there's a kind of compensation bias effect, confirmation bias effect, I beg your pardon. Even if you're confronted with the truth, sometimes you stick with the opinions that you've had and that your peer group recycles. So there are sociological explanations of how these things reinforce themselves as well, which is really important when it comes to deconstructing all this, because it might be much more difficult than we think, because it might not just be a case of presenting people with reality. That might not dismantle all of their beliefs.
We're running low a little bit on time. I will just take...
My fault, because I talked too
No.
long.
It's very interesting, Professor Wilson. Nothing online? Okay, so the third row gentleman with the beard. Yes, please. And if you could identify yourself.
My name is John, part of the community that comes to some of the wonderful monk events. Andrew Wilson, well, maybe not so much enjoy. What a wall of propaganda it's so dense, became difficult to follow. Maybe a little bit based on this question over here. For half my life, it was the Soviet Union. About half my life, it's been Russia. And I've had generally this impression of Russians being smart and culturally aware, the Bolshoi and classical music and well-educated and all these kinds of perspectives I have. Chess masters and all these kinds of things which might be stereotypical, but it's a bit surprising. But if you have a wall year after year, decades now, maybe that becomes it. There's a cost if you resist. But one of the things, and that 70%, over 70% graph, that was very good of you to show, one of the things I think that might hit home are the deaths and injuries of Russian soldiers. And I think of the Vietnam War with Americans coming home, granted, TV cameras were watching all that stuff too a little bit more. How were Russians digesting that aspect, that kind of truth-telling when it's your brother or your neighbor across the street is no longer with you?
Well, there is a. It's well established that casualties in the Afghan war were extremely damaging for the Soviet Union in the 80s. And we're way beyond that. Way beyond that. By multitudes. The current system really doesn't care about ordinary Russians. The people who are dying are not the sons of the elite. They're not Muscovites. They're not from Petersburg. They're hugely disproportionately from the provinces and from the non-Russian republics. So if you're sitting comfortably in Moscow, you're not seeing many body bags or funerals. Some people have used innovative ways to kind of quantify and publicize number of deaths. Things like pension payments, insurance payouts, you can check on. But that's not the same as the kind of visceral impact of public funerals or whatever, which the authorities try to minimise. So given the scale, there hasn't been much reaction yet. Well, that's a ratio of casualty and sacrifice to performance, and performance is fictitious. All right? So at the moment, the Kremlin can sell the story that the sacrifice is worth it for the story about victory that they've created. And they're quite capable of doing that on many levels. It's a completely different story if the Russian lines collapse, all right? And there is a problem in that sense. Maybe there was a time in 2022 when we were almost near that, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So at the moment, not really much of a problem for a Kremlin which doesn't care that much.
Gentleman in the first row.
Thanks very much. It was a most enlightening lecture, if only because of the scale and detail of what you're describing. But what I would like to ask, and I realize I might be opening a can of worms or at least a slippery slope to another hour's talk, is you didn't mention the impact of this on the power structures in the West, academic, media, and political. And I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about what kind of an impact is being had on what in the good old days we used to call useful idiots.
Well, various people became aware of the scale of Russian operations abroad at different times. Maybe against Ukraine in 2014, maybe in 2004. Maybe against America, 2016. But they've got bigger, and they're extremely variegated and sophisticated. For the Kremlin, I think the estimate is about 3 billion a year is spent on information and active operations abroad. 3 billion US equivalent. That is money well spent from their point of view. In terms of impact and in terms of being cheaper than conventional war. And these Russian operations are very cynically sophisticated at micro-targeting, all sorts of groups, fishers, problems within Western societies. You could just look at the recent Romanian election. Romania used to laugh at Moldova and how it was vulnerable to Russian special operations, and now Russian-backed guy is ahead in their presidential race. So Russia also targets agents of influence, useful idiots, left, right, all sorts of political fissures wherever it can. The historical meaning of useful idiot was fellow traveller in Soviet times, by definition, on the left. Is that what you meant?
I think it's close. I'm not sure that useful idiot and Sputnik were entirely identical, but close enough.
Yeah. There are some audiences on the left to whom you can sell. I mean, the most successful three narratives that have been sold to the Western left, I think, are expansion of NATO is to blame for the current war, and therefore we are to blame. That Russia is somehow an anti-imperial power because America is the biggest imperial power. So imposing that imperial power is a lesser evil. So there are some on the left for whom anti-Americanism trumps everything else. And thirdly, that anti-colonial argument works surprisingly well in parts of the global south, where despite Russia conducting a re-imperializing war, it can its narratives about the West being this being a war of one part of the West against Russia, when the West is guilty of worse colonialisms in Africa or wherever, has some traction in those parts of the world, and in some parts of Western left who sympathise with those parts of the world. So that confines the answer to the left. You don't really get anybody who believes that Russia is a left-wing project anymore. So that type of fellow traveller doesn't really exist. But you also get plenty of right-wing fellow travellers now as well. In fact, more. Tucker Carlson in Moscow at the moment being one.
It's quite surprising, just to finish my bit off here, it's quite surprising how well first the Soviet Union and then Russia have managed to position themselves as a colonialist state, when in fact they've been one of the biggest, most successful, and most repressive. And this has been going on since before Soviet times.
Yeah, with Russia in Africa currently being able to use a mythologized version of the benevolence of the Soviet Union to what are now middle-aged or older African leaders back in the 70s or 80s.
Just one more bit. I'm not sure what the demographic in the room is, but if you look back at the Cold War, there was a book called The Ugly American about American imperialism in the Third World, and it was answered by a book called The Ugly Russian, which turned it on its side. I don't know if anybody's actually run across either or both of those. They're worth a look back for more than nostalgia.
Thank you.
Professor Sisson. Yeah, yes, I know. I will get to you, Professor Sisson.
Yeah, Frank Sisson. When the full-scale invasion came, one could argue there was much surprise within Ukraine even about the reaction. And what I wonder is there any adjustment that goes on in Russia in these various techniques? That is, the fact that the Russian speakers on the line generally fought and stood for Ukraine, or in various ways things have not worked quite as might be expected by the propaganda. So do you see shifts and changes, or does it just continue on and then these groups have to all be destroyed?
Well, before February 2022, you had a guy called Mikhail Pogrebinski, a Ukrainian political technologist working under Viktor Medvedchuk, who was doing opinion polls for Putin about Russian speakers in Ukraine, about people in the south and east, and feeding it back to Putin. And you can see Putin, in fact, there's a scene where Pogrebinski feeds Putin at the Valdai summit. It says, data shows that people in Ukraine are turning back to Russia. And Putin says, yes. When Pogrebinski fled, there was all this data found in his flat about how he'd massaged the figures upwards in a kind of series of Potemkin reporting steps, so that when they reach Putin's ear, he's getting a distorted picture. But I think this narrative is so existential that you don't get any adjustment on the big questions. Right? So some people have looked at propaganda in the temporarily occupied territories. Is it different in Kherson to Zaporizhia or anything? No, not really. And the methods adopted are pretty brutal. There's no sense of, oh, these people didn't welcome us, therefore we have to have a different strategy. But you do get some adjustment in how you propagandize the rest of Ukraine, because you've seen Russia shift to performance issues. And trying to latch on to genuine debates. Are the elite, corruption? Are the children of the elite fighting in the war? Taking these kind of real popular concerns and throwing petrol on them. So shifting for the kind of more existential questions about whether you support Russia or not. So that's quite a complicated answer. In some ways, you're blinded. You can't see round the kind of core elements of your narrative, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. But there's this entire service industry for propaganda out there, which is pretty decentralized and quite pragmatic. I think someone like Kirienko just gives an order: just do what you can do to make things difficult for Zelensky or whatever. So then, at a lower level, people sort of propagandize a bit more pragmatically. But there wasn't a reckoning for Pogrebinski's boss, Medvedchuk, right, who is first arrested and then is exchanged with Russia for a lot of Ukrainian prisoners of war because he was valuable to Putin. There was no reckoning when he got back to Russia. No one said, your propaganda, your opinion polls were rubbish. In fact, the Russians have given him more money to conduct more propaganda operations. He has this other Ukraine operation. He's been financing propaganda networks out of the Czech Republic. So far from being seen as a failed investment, Russia is giving him more money to do the same things again.
I will now ask the very patient individual in the third row to give his question.
Hi, thank you, Professor. My name is Chris. I'm a student of applied science here at the University of Toronto. And I just want to go back to a point you made near the beginning of your talk, where you mentioned that to us as outsiders to this narrative, it seems absurd. But at one time, I take it at one time, the Russian people too were outsiders to this narrative when it was first given to them. So my question is, what factors can make a person or a people, if you would prefer, more susceptible to what you call a political technology? And thank you.
I'd slightly changed the way you phrased it. There wasn't a big narrative that was suddenly presented ex nihilo to Russians who hadn't heard it before. So it's this kind of snowballing effect in the 90s and the noughties, whereby you slowly see the political system with more and more artificial elements until you end up controlling it all. And the same with narrative and propaganda. You start off with individual elements, and eventually you're controlling a dominant narrative, which might have rivals, but then you marginalize them, and your narrative gets even more dominant. So you capture people to that process because it's that slow, cumulative process. Because it doesn't work if you confront people overnight with a 180-degree handbrake turn. You believe A, so we're now telling you B. Not how propaganda works. You get people down these rabbit holes and make them deeper. But that required a lot of money and resources. It required specific things about the structure of media. It was very important for Putin. The first thing that Putin did, more or less, as president, was take over the big TV stations. Ditto in occupied Crimea. First thing they do is install Russian propaganda. And there was a big problem with internet and social media, because unlike China, where internet and then social media were controlled from the moment of arrival, in Russia, online world was basically more or less free until 2012. So that was a real management problem. And it's why initially the characteristic Russian political technology method online was trolling. In China, it's not. It's you control the platforms and you have the great firewall against the outside world. Whereas in Russia, you had opposition voices, so you had to attack and discredit them. That was a long time ago now. The world online in Russia is now much more controlled. But that was a kind of catch-up operation because it was a real problem for the regime in 2011, 2012 that it controlled TV but not internet and social media. So now it's made sure that it does. Yeah.
Do we have an online question, Marco?
Yes.
Okay, yes, we do have an online question. I will read it as it was written. Today, the Canadian media outlet published an article about the so-called Ukrainian Nazis. This is a well-known media outlet, the Ottawa Citizen, which has been looking for Nazis among the Ukrainian community in Canada for over 30 years. My question is, do you think that there are many people in the Western media and academia who are working for Russian propaganda?
Define working for. Paid to work for? Saying the same things as? Saying things that have the same consequences as? Aligned with some of the themes of? You could find various people in all those categories. Though English libel law would prevent me saying anything about the first category. But Russian propaganda also, or Russian special operations abroad, are also very skilled at seeking out voices that they can exploit. Either there's certain people saying X, Y, and Z anyway, so you can give them a platform to say X, Y, and Z. Or that you can exploit to reach a bigger audience, which is very important for the Russians. RT, which used to be Russia Today, doesn't really exist for its direct audience. It exists to be quoted. Right? And for its narratives to spread, it's called secondary infection in Russia, its narratives to spread out into more mainstream media. So the aspect of the story about this young political technologist, Ilya Gambashidze, that I didn't talk about, was that this network had given US media operatives $10 million, right? And these were big players in the kind of right-wing media ecosystem with millions of followers, tens of millions of tens of millions of views on YouTube in particular. Tenet Media, they're called. So exploit, ally with. There are various ways that Russian media can exploit people in the West.
I think we will take one more question. Yes, on the edge of the row there, I see a hand. Yes, please.
Well, it's two. You can do two.
Thank you very much, Professor. My name's Alex. I'm not a poli-sci major, but I watch a lot of podcasts. So it seems to me that Russia is very good at propaganda. And then, so my question for you is, and also Russia has real nuclear weapons. So my question for you is, if you are the director of CIA, let's just assume, what's your game plan and how would you beat Putin, if you want?
Is that a question about how do you deal with the propaganda effect of the nuclear threat, or?
Given your extensive knowledge of, how bulletproof the Russian propaganda is in terms of the bullets, if it wants to cheat, how would you have a breakthrough to achieve, I guess, the five eyes goals?
Well, there's been, in this and other areas, some good academic studies about what works and what doesn't work. Fact-checking, fact rebuttal has really low success rates. It doesn't really penetrate the kind of hive mentalities, the groupthink that's part of the problem. If it's seen as an outsider talking across some kind of barrier to another group, it doesn't really work. Depicting people as the victims of propaganda is now officially elitist. Right? Certainly didn't work in the recent US election. Right? But their academic study is about confirmation bias. That if people are confronted with facts or opinions that contradict their kind of core beliefs, they stick with the beliefs rather than the facts. So what does work? Deplatforming works. It worked in Ukraine when the pro-Russian conspiracy theory media of Viktor Medvedchuk was dismantled in February 2021, precisely because it was popular and such a threat to national security. And Ukraine would have been in a much weaker place if it hadn't done that in February 2022, if such a propaganda network still exists. In fact, the main reason why Ukraine sticks with this united TV marathon of all main TV channels is to prevent Russian mainstream propaganda getting a foothold again in a more pluralistic media environment. It worked when Trump was removed from Twitter. His audience disappeared. If you ask me for one big reason why Trump won in 2024 was that he built his audience back up again. So what you need to do for the Russian propaganda system is deplatform. Right? To dismantle, I mean, a lot of you said dense, complicated structures, which is definitely the point. They're all interlocking. So you need to start breaking that up. It was very difficult to change hearts and minds in post-war Germany, and that was occupied. Don't think Russia is likely to be occupied by the West. So how do you change its information and its propaganda environment from outside? Or how do you encourage émigré Russians, currently émigré Russians, to play a part, or Russian speakers in the former Soviet space to play a part? I think all of those elements would be key. But I'll repeat the point I made at the start, that peace requires more than military victory. If there's a military victory and all of this is still going on, Russians are being taught that the West is out to destroy them via Ukraine, then we won't have a stable peace.
Do we have a quick question in the back there?
It ties well to what you were just talking about. I'm a student at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs in Ottawa. Thank you for talking to us today. You just mentioned deplatforming, and specifically in Russia, to kind of reverse what's been done within Russia, kind of the war for hearts and minds there. But I see also a very major sort of threat, and actually a very active threat, that Russia has already infiltrated a lot of hearts and minds in the West. And there are certain very favorable conditions for that. For example, the growing rift between the global South and the global North, or the West collectively, and social media, and just these, the rise in populism, the rise in authoritarianism, the the coalition that Russia is successfully building with Iran, North Korea, to a sort of to a more covert extent, China. Do you think that the West stands a chance at preventing its own citizens en masse from being effectively successfully converted by Russian propaganda, and how can it undo the damage that's already been done? Thank you.
We can't finish with that question, which is so depressing. I didn't talk about the subtitle of my recent book, which is called The Globalization of Political Manipulation, meaning two things. Russia develops these techniques at home and then it exports them. But there are plenty of domestic developments in other parts of the world which meet the definition of political technology given of supply-side engineering in the political system. And networks through which all these developments influence each other, and technologies which can't be uninvented, in which the things may be about to get a lot worse. You can see. Well, I just asked my class three very carefully phrased questions. What normal politics reasons are there to explain Trump's victory? I think that's important because he won comfortably. What political technology reasons helped him win? I think that's the right way to phrase it. And what types of political technology might play a role in Trump's presidency from here onward? And a fourth question might be about interactions between political networks linked with Trump, linked with Fidesz in Hungary, Tucker Carlson in Moscow, going to come home with the right lot of propaganda. And tech developments. If X becomes a much more right-wing platform and everybody else moves to other platforms, then you're only going to get more segmentation of alternative realities, some of which are more real than others, but basically alternative narrative universes. So we can't end there because you're right, and that's a really depressing world.
If anybody has any other questions or comments, you can talk to Professor Wilson at the reception. Right now, I would like to thank Professor Wilson for his really excellent, thought-provoking lecture. And I would also like to thank the co-organizers of this event, the Petro Jacek Program for the Study of Ukraine and the Center for European and Eurasian Studies, and especially point people Olga Kesarchuk, Tanya Mechta, and Ksenia Kibzinski. And we are also grateful to the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto for hosting this lecture, and these gorgeous premises are so wonderful to be in, and to the technical and front of house teams for your wonderful expert assistance. And finally, I would like to thank all of our attendees on site and online for coming to this lecture. And I now invite our offline attendees to join us at the reception in the next room, which is catered by Acacia Cafe. Thank you.